Hello, everyone. This is Josephson from Nexus TV, and you're watching Zoom Boom. Thanks very much for being with us, and I welcome Mr. Kenneth Scott from Gemstone University. This university is a knowledge platform for Pantera de Oro private society. And Mr. Kenneth Scott is a lawyer, and he's with us, and we are very pleased to have him here. Hello, Mr. Scott.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Mr. Scott, you're an expert in the things which concerned our world today, meaning you're expert especially in the legal part. This is your expertise, especially. I would like to ask you about how we can develop a world, but before we come to that point, I would like to ask you, how did we get here to this stage where we are? And from this perspective, it would be wonderful to just summarize for our viewers where we are actually. And in order to do that, I would love to ask you to summarize to us from the beginning of our millennia. As we know, we started our millennia with a person called Jesus coming here, and he's forming a church. Some people say he was not a real person. Some people say he was. Anyway, what the conclusion was that his church became the ruling church of the Holy Roman Empire. What would you say about the Holy Roman Empire or the papacy, which developed from then on?
Okay, big question. First of all, very briefly, I will give you a very brief summary of my background. I have been studying these subjects virtually my whole life. I'm now 68 years old, and I had a strong impulse and fascination with studying deeper things in our world at a very early age, 5, 6, 7 years old. And by my teenage years, I was studying, looking to find answers to root questions such as what you have asked. That led me into studying origins of religion. Eventually, I got into the law arena about 32 years ago. I started studying law in 1990. And the study of law requires, if you really want to understand it, a true mastery of the subject of what we would call history. Now, history is a very multi-layered subject. There's the public narrative, the global narrative that most people are taught in school. And then there's a whole lot more that we're not taught, that we have to search out.
Definitely.
The study of law and the study of history will absolutely require you to then study the mechanics of the monetary systems, banking, finance, how money is created, and how the law and the money system work hand in hand. They're really flip sides of the same coin, as a system of creating a global system, essentially for the purpose of controlling all the people in the world, controlling all the resources, controlling the people so that they can be the labor force to take those resources and build a world system. We are now living in that world system. As we can readily see, as I'm sure you know, and your team and your viewers, the world system has been constructed to basically be a global prison. So that's the essence of it. So we need to understand, how does that work? Based on your question, what are the origins? You bring up Jesus, and as a millennial construct, going back 2,000 years, so 2 millennia, and entered into the 3rd millennia since 22 years ago. That, of course, then you raise the point. Is he a real person? Was he a fabrication? Then you asked about the Roman Church and the Holy Roman Empire. Most people group all those things together, but they're actually separate and distinct lines of development and creation that have been designed and do function synergistically or connected, but it's very important to really get very precise in it. So I can outline what's required for that precision. We can't go into all the detail because that's something that's literally a lifetime study. What's required for that lifetime study is for somebody, a being, a man or a woman, or even young children, to have the passion to learn. Because the world designed through the education, the social and economic structures, and the political structures, and the media especially, pretty well creates an environment where people become dumbed down. They become habituated to accept what's considered normal, whether that's classroom normal in the schools or in the business world, the political world, or what's taught in the media. If you don't have that personal drive and that passion to really learn and understand, you will never break through that barrier.
Wow, that's important, yes.
Yeah, so that's a beginning point. So in describing my background, my life history, I had that passion from an early age. And now with what we've created for the last 20 years called Pantera de Oral Society and the Gemstone University, we've been interacting with thousands of people. We have many hundreds of members in Pantera, which is a private organization. It's a private society, and it's based on membership. Plus, I do things to a limited extent through YouTube and other media platforms in terms of public interface and so forth. But by and large, we've kept it private because being private is a very key thing, and understanding the nature of jurisdiction and how the law form works within jurisdiction. There's a distinction between what's in the public and what's private. And so our organization is a private society. We have actually established our own jurisdiction. You can do that, but it requires a vast amount and precise knowledge, information, and how to integrate that.
That means the private society you have is independent of the current system.
Basically, yes, and it's using the law form. And what's very important to understand of how we have done that is we don't polarize with the current system. We don't make it the enemy. There's a lot of details relates to the monetary system and how commerce, commercial instruments, commercial paper, the things we call currency, whether that's a euro, Federal Reserve note, or the other currencies. Ultimately, the definition of those is they're circulating medium that are established as commercial paper within the public system. So I'll just say that for now. We'll come back to that because I want to address your starting question. The basis, the foundation, the origins, and the history of that, leading to what many people know and understand is the pyramidal and hierarchical structure that has the Roman Catholic Church at the top, controlling through 3 city-states that many of your viewers, I'm sure, have seen and understand. So we'll come to that in a moment. But ultimately, the Roman Catholic Church controls this world, or has up to this time, by the function of how religion has been created and structured. Obviously, a pinnacle or a key point of that is the New Testament, the life of Jesus, and the whole storyline that was developed with that, built upon the Old Testament. But we have to go much deeper in history. We have to understand the roots and the origins of both the historical narrative as well as the linguistic, because so much of how law and money and our world system and our mental concept of how the world is, as we believe it to be, is based on the fundamentals and the origins of language. Language has been a tool that's been used over the last 5,000 to 6,000 years as a primary control mechanism, where we say one thing, we think we know what we're talking about. Obviously, English is your second language, but you speak it quite fluently. So I'm sure you understand a lot about the English language and the use of words. But we use a lot of words in our everyday conversation, in our legal proceedings, in our financial or business proceedings, and we think we know what we're saying, but when we get into law and the definitions of law, legal words, they actually mean quite a different thing. And then when we go even further back and we look at the construction of the religious structure, obviously the primary controlling mechanism or element of that is the Old and the New Testament. There's a tremendous amount of things that have been done through the history of the last 5,000 years that have taken the roots of language, utilized them essentially as a mind control mechanism, so that we think we're existing in one reality, but we're really Alice in Wonderland. We're through the looking glass, we're behind the mirror, and everything is talking backwards. You're familiar with the story of Alice in Wonderland, right?
Yeah, sure. And actually, when we are hearing phrases like "land of the sea" and so on, then we think that they live in a wonderland. Those people who talk about that, they are in the wonderland. Actually, we are in the wonderland when we are not understanding them. Is it right?
Yes. We are actually living in a real world, the physical world. A lot of people in spiritual paths and New Age beliefs and even religious contexts like to say that, oh, this world is an illusion, it's not real. But the reality is the physical world, the life systems, the plants and animals and the ecosystems and the water systems and everything, and our physical bodies, that's real substance. But our mind and our consciousness has been entrained to project itself behind the looking glass, where we say something that we believe is what we're saying, has a definition, but it's actually the opposite of that. The controlling mechanisms of the legal system, the monetary system, the political system, they will take what we say based on those original definitions or those definitions in law. So that's a generalization. We don't have time to go into that in detail, but this is the kind of thing that we teach in Gemstone University. So people...
Would you just express one example, please, so that people understand, because that's not really graspable for the first time for someone who hears it.
Sure.
You're not really speaking the real language. I mean.
Right, exactly. Well, for example, you referred to me as Mr. Kenneth Scott, because that's the name, the two names, Kenneth and Scott, that I use for most of my documents now or things that I do in the public. First of all, the word Mr., we take that as just a natural thing. Here's Mr. or Miss or Mrs., but it has a definition in law that's quite different. Secondly, my full name that's on my birth certificate, that's includes my family name, is Kenneth Scott Cousins. Now, why don't I use the name Cousins anymore? Well, I use it in a specific way, but if I say I'm Mr. Kenneth Scott Cousins, I've just actually, in the language of law, defined myself as a fiction. And then I've defined myself as something that is owned and controlled by the system. I'm here in North America, the country called United States, and people in the United States, by and large, say that, well, we're a constitutional republic, and this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. But there are many things that have happened in the last 150 to 200 years that literally turned that upside down. Because in actual fact, the United States in the last 150 years has been operating as a corporation. That corporation was put into bankruptcy starting in 1933. And actually, there was an original bankruptcy as soon as the Constitution was issued in 1789, as soon as they sat the first Congress and the first president. So we believe we're in a free system here, but in fact, it's a mirrored system, and it's been turned inside out. So starting in the year 1933, the United States was put into full bankruptcy. And when you use your full name, including the family name, what people call a surname, that you are actually saying that you're a fiction in law, not a real living being, and that the surname is actually tied to part of that corporation that's in bankruptcy. This in turn goes all the way back to Roman law. This goes back to Rome 2000, more or less 2000 years. You're speaking of Jesus Christ 2000 years ago. Well, that happened in a particular time in history, 2000 years ago. And as we all know, that they do teach us, Rome created an empire, and it had, significant military force, and it conquered a good part of Europe, Northern Africa, all the way to the Western Isles, what we call the British Isles right now. And they established a law form that was essentially the rules of war and the rules of conquest. And then they created a law form called Roman civil law. Roman civil law is how a body of people that in Latin is called the civitas, how they are going to be managed, what the rules that apply to the civil body. Well, the civil body is a conquered people, and they are now under a military conquered authority. Okay, so you're in Hungary, you have, and that was part of Roman territory 2,000 years ago. There are things that were put in place over the last 1,500 to 2,000 years that established other things in Europe, and also primarily through Spain, but secondarily through England. This structure of Roman civil law or military conquest was extended to the Americas, first through the Spanish Empire, and then secondly, ultimately through the English Empire, what we call the British Empire. And that involves the Holy Roman Empire. Okay. But in the way you presented it, you made two things as if they were the same or the equivalent: the Roman Catholic Church and the Roman Holy Roman Empire. Okay. They're two distinct entities. Okay. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
Okay. Well, the history of the Holy Roman Empire is that in the years roughly the 5th century, 400s through to the 8th century, the 700s, certain things were occurring in Western Europe, primarily in the area we call France. Certain bloodlines were brought from the Middle East and started establishing a position in France, eventually in northern France, in the area that we now call Paris. And the culmination of that is in the year 800. This man that is known in history as Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, became the first Holy Roman Emperor. Okay. Between the year 800 and the year 962, that evolved into Europe. And in 962, it became formalized by a man who became the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was known as Otto the Great. And he was in your area, not really Hungary, but you've got Hungary, and then you've got Austria, Germany. That central part of Europe was the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, it's a distinct, different entity than the Roman Church. The Roman Church emerged in a similar time frame because you have the Western Roman Empire and you have the Eastern Roman Empire. You got Rome and Constantinople. They were created in the early centuries of from the time of Jesus to 400, 500, 600. But the Western Roman Empire as an empire collapsed in the year 473. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, lasted another 1,000 years. It's called the Byzantium Empire. Okay, it lasted till somewhere around the 1470s. In the meantime, they created the Holy Roman Empire to be a distinct and parallel entity. And by the 1400s, the Holy Roman Emperor was always from the House of Habsburg. Okay, you're familiar with the House of Habsburg, right?
Definitely.
Okay,
Yeah.
so based in Vienna. And then what happened with the basically the Austrian Empire over the next few hundred years? It became the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So then that includes your country, and Austria became essentially another empire operating parallel with the Habsburg, which was based in Germany in Hanover, the House of Habsburg and the Holy Roman Emperor.
Mr. Scott, if we browse the Holy Roman Empire and check Wikipedia, it says it was discontinued in 1806.
Correct. Okay.
So how does this follow up from the Eastern?
Well, because in 1806, basically the House of Habsburg was defeated by Napoleon. Okay, so that's a key period too. I mean, again, we've got vast elements of history that have intersecting, and it can be complicated, but this is what I've studied along with the study of law and otherwise to see how the flow of history moved over thousands of years to eventually create this global world system that we have today. So Napoleon, of course, attempted to conquer all of Europe and set himself up as the emperor. He defeated the House of Habsburg in 1806, and so that's technically the collapse of the so-called Holy Roman Empire. But prior to that, from the early 1500s, there was a Habsburg who was sitting on the throne of Spain starting in the early 1500s. He was Carlos V, and he sat on the throne in 1520. And he was actually a grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, who had consolidated the Spanish state in the late 1490s. So he then was appointed or set as the Holy Roman Emperor. He was from the House of Habsburg, and then he conquered through the Spanish the entirety of basically from the top of Mexico. Actually, California was included, and the Southwest states, all the way down through Mexico, Central America, all the way to the end of South America. That again were military conquered states or territories, and the people, they were all put into Roman civil law. So if you look at the law systems of the world, besides, say, Sharia law in the Middle East, and then the Indian, Chinese, Hindu, and all of those sects, if you look in the West, you have three basic law forms. You have the Roman civil law, you have the American system, which is based on English law and some of the unique things that America did through the Revolutionary War and Declaration of Independence. And then you have the British system, the English Commonwealth. Supposedly the English Commonwealth and the American system are based on English common law. But through financial events, when America and all of the nation states were put first into a position of being corporations, and then those corporations were put into bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is a function of admiralty maritime jurisdiction. It's not the law of the land. It's the law of the sea. Yeah. And when an entity is in admiralty jurisdiction and it's in bankruptcy according to that jurisdiction, the rules that will be applied to the people and persons and property are going to be Roman civil law.
So if we may just summarize it till here. So that was the Pope as the, let's say, religious entity, and then the Holy Roman Empire as the military body, let's say.
It was like more of a military body, exactly. They separated it, and they maintained the Vatican as the spiritual, non-military, but they set up the Holy Roman Empire to be the conquering entity to conquer these nations and ultimately put them all into Roman civil law, which is the law of conquered peoples. It's the management of the civil body.
And who was the leader of these two bodies? Which one was the leader, the Pope or the Emperor?
Well, the emperor was the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Pope was, ostensibly the leader of the Vatican, the Holy See, the papacy, and all of that.
What was their connection, if I may ask? So basically, this was equal, or they were under one was under the other.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, at the pinnacle of a hierarchy in a pyramidal structure, the Vatican or the Holy See would be the top. But you asked before we started recording about the three city-states. So what's important to understand is that, Carlos V became the Holy Roman Emperor from 1520 onward, and in the 1700s, it shifted to the English. And so then the English king under George the First, Second, and Third in the 1700s became the Holy Roman Emperor, and were also of the House of Hanover, another Germanic principality. So, as you also know, I'm sure that Germany, what we call Germany today, was a collection of up to about 300 principalities until it was consolidated into a nation state in 1870. And so you have these things, you've got all these parallel historical movements moving side by side, moving towards an ultimate integrated global plan.
I would love to mention in our discussion one major event about King John, the Magna Carta, and also the special agreements of Verona. If you may say a few things about it, because maybe this would be useful before we come to Washington. I believe you come to the point that the second city state may be the Washington D.C. and how they come.
Well, the second one was the city of London.
Okay.
Okay. The city of London was established in very soon after the Roman period, and where we started from. You're asking about Jesus and all of that. The city of London actually started existing in the first century AD. It was formalized under the Norman conquest, who's the man known as William the Conqueror in the year 1066. And of course, he was from northern France. And of course, he was Catholic. So this was a Catholic extension to then establish the city of London. There's a lot of history behind that, going back to Mideast and events in the last century BC, first century AD. But it was the beginning of, or not the beginning, but the continuation of establishing what ultimately would be the three city-states: the Vatican, London, City of London, and Washington, D.C. And but by the time we have George III, and we have the colonies in North America, the 13 colonies, he was technically, he was a Hanover, so he comes from the German Principality of Hanover, which had created bloodline unions with a lot of the Italian states, primarily Venice. And so you have the Venetian, what are known as the Venetian Black nobility, or the Venetian oligarchies, that started in probably the 400s and built vast amounts of wealth, built the banking system, had interfaced with the East and West, even though Rome, Western Rome, collapsed in 473. Venice started emerging in that time period. So by the time you get into the 1000, 1100, 1200 centuries, you've got Venice, very powerful, that's been working with Constantinople, or the Byzantium Empire.
Like the Medici families and so on.
Yeah, the Medici and the Orsini and all of the rest. And by the 1200s, those Venetian families started moving up to the area that we now call the Netherlands. And then you have the Dutch principalities. And there was actually a period where in Holland or the Netherlands, it was called the United States. So that was the first United States in the Netherlands. And then they established their Dutch East Indies Company, Dutch West Indies Company, and you have the British East Indies Company, and you have the other companies, Royal Charter companies coming out of the city of London, such as the Hudson Bay Company, the South Africa Company, many other companies. And those companies became the principal commercial extensions of the city of London through the period of conquest and the period of commercialization, colonialization throughout the world between the 1600s and the 1800s. Eventually, all those companies were set up to be put into bankruptcy and then converted to secular governmental bodies. So the Hudson Bay Company was converted into what we call the nation of Canada. This East India Company was essentially converted into the United States and the United States of America, and so forth. So this is a evolution and a sequence of events during basically over the last 1,000 years. If we were to summarize it, it was all to set up a structure where you have a global system of military conquered entities, nation state, or countries that were then converted to corporations. Those corporations were then put into bankruptcy through the mechanisms of the banking system, eventually the central bank system. And then as bankrupt entities, their people converted to fictions in law persons, as I said before, the surname, what we call our last name, that goes back to something that was instituted by our friend Napoleon. Napoleon issued what became the Napoleonic Code, and that was completed in the year 1804. The Napoleonic Code was a restatement of the Roman civil law, okay? The law of the civil body, the management of the body of the people as conquered peoples and territories. And that ties into when, in 1803, the United States purchased Louisiana. They bought it from Napoleon so he could continue paying for his wars. That was all the French territory in North America. And that was a grounding point for Roman civil law in the form of Napoleonic Code to be rooted or grounded into the United States and North America. So, I'm giving you the highlights. I'm trying to give you a sense of the sweep of history, the parallel tracks, the interweaving tracks, leading to a global state in which all the nation states are bankrupt corporations, and the people now must operate through a bankrupt franchise, because we're basically a bankrupt franchise as a subdivision of the bankrupt nation states. And so in the Napoleonic Code, that's where the surname came in. Okay, that's where they said it basically constructed the surname, or what we call the last name, as a part of the Napoleonic Code, aka the Roman Civil Code.
People didn't have a surname before?
Not that much. Mainly the surname was the house or the lord of the manor, the landed estates. So you have all of the titles, earls and barons and counts and dukes and princes. Those are titles that were given by the sovereign, the king. The king, in turn, was all the houses of Europe, all the monarchies and of England. They eventually were distributed to be controlling through the monarchies and the sovereign status of the king or the queen, basically all of Europe, as a grant of authority and power by who? By the Pope, who was the one who always, either himself or his delegate, put the crown on the king's head. Okay, was the Pope. Okay, so if somebody accepts a title from somebody who's essentially in a superior position. That superior position owns and controls that entity, crowned as a king or crowned as a queen, and so forth. So,
how could the Pope do that? Why was he able to do that legally? Was that connected to the let's say the 1213 agreement?
Well, that's a major part of it, because that's what happened in England. What you have to understand when you ask about John is in 1213, John conveyed all rights, title, and interest in his crown, in his land, and his kingdom to the Pope. Okay, are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
That's something. Okay, so that's something that people call, it's called the Holy Alliance. Most people who've studied this,
I'm not sure people know that. I'm not sure many people know that. It's very
most
important,
people
I guess.
don't. Yeah, it's, if you look it up, if you put the year 1213 Holy Alliance, you will find that essentially John feared for his mortal soul. He had sinned and all these other things. So the binding aspect of all of this ultimately does get back to the religion, and which we will come back to, because we started with, discussing the roots of religion and the roots of language. And that really starts with Sumeria, moves into Egypt, moves into Acadia, the Akkadian empire, the Persian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, and ultimately into Babylon, and then eventually into Rome. And so that's where we get into the origins of religion and the evolution of it over the last 5,000 years. So by the time we get to the Roman period with the Caesars, Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, you have the Christ event, you've got the creation of the New Testament. And we can get to that, touch on that briefly when you say, well, was he real or not?
Yeah. So at the point when the Pope took over the ownership of all lands, he claimed in 1213 from King John.
Yeah.
At that time, the power of the religious leader, as it is, have been already established, because from the Sumerian Empire on, it has been established. So that's the reason why he could do that. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. Basically, there's something that is fundamental to the work and research I've done for all the last 25 to 30 years. It's what I call the principle of the two pillars. That goes back to Sumerian and Egyptian and Babylonian period. And it's also in the esoteric, because if you don't also include understanding and integrating how it fits together, the esoteric, you're missing an entire major piece of it. And that's something that I've been immersed in studying since a very early age, since I was 7 years old. And in the esoteric, you will find, and this is very, very much, it's in the Bible, it's in the book of Genesis, and it's very much in the Masonic systems. They speak of the two pillars. They also speak of the mantle, what's called the mantle or the lintel or the arch that connects the two pillars. Okay. And
the arch is the Pope? I mean, the religious leader?
Well, the arch is actually, but he's really the front guy. The arch goes back to the Sumerian and Egyptian period where it emerged, which basically is the gods, the pantheon. And really in Egypt, it was known as the Ennead, or the Council of Nine. In Latin and in English, Ennea, Ennea, means nine. And so there was a group of gods, the Ennead, that were 9 in total. And the head honcho, the head of it, was known as Anu. Okay, so it gets back to who is Anu. It gets back to who were the Anunnaki, or the Anunna. The word ki in Sumerian means the earth. So the Anunna means basically the people of Anu who control the earth.
And he led the group of Ennead that controls the earth through a religious leader, currently the Pope. So we can read about it, for example, on the Sumerian tablets, like the last book of Enki and so on.
Yeah. But you have to be very careful, because what's out there most popular in the sort of the popular known public arena is a man named Zachariah Sitchin. Basically, Sitchin was a agent of Rothschild. Okay, he was funded by Rothschild. He was obviously a very intelligent and learned man, but a lot of what he put in place in his popularized materials and books was very inaccurate, pretty much mythology. And now, but because it was out there first in the 70s and 80s and onward, I read his work in the 1990s, early 1990s, and it got connected to the New Age movement and the popularized spiritual movements and so forth. And so that became sort of the basis of what people thought about the Sumerian texts and so forth. There's a lot more, really much more accurate and real knowledge and information about that. And what I would recommend for yourself and everybody listening, a man who I'm reading virtually all of his materials right now, who, as far as I'm concerned, is absolutely a master of the Sumerian and Egyptian period. His name is Anton Parks. He's a Frenchman. That's kind of his pen name. It's not a French name, but he had some extraordinary avenues in which things open up for him at an early age. I won't go into it. People can look him up. In fact, I think his website, pretty sure it's antonparks.com. But if you just put that in a search engine, you'll find him. And I absolutely, if you want to learn the origins of history, the origins of a lot of things that I reference about language, his work is absolutely paramount. And this would take a couple of hours of conversation, and I'd be happy to do more conversations with you to go into how I've pieced together my worldview in terms of the historical framework, building towards what we talked about earlier, basically how religion is the foundation, side by side with language and linguistics, building towards creating religious books and documents that became the controlling documents of empires, societies, city-states, and so forth, that all eventually were synthesized and integrated by Rome. So you have the Judaic Israel period, starting with the Davidic line, that really is the fundamental basis for the claim of who Jesus was, the claim of who Rome is, and eventually everything leading up to today. The other man that I have been studying quite extensively now, that I find absolutely a solid resource, is a man named Ralph Ellis. And too much to summarize here, try to give any detail. So I'll just say that for me, and I've been working for decades to piece together the integration of all of these subjects we're talking about. For me, finding Anton Parks and Ralph Ellis has been absolutely game changing to really integrate and understand where the Sumerian Egyptian led into the Judaic period, because basically, what do we say the law form on this planet is? It's basically Judeo-Christian. Okay, Judeo-Christian controls our political structure, our macro scale geopolitical structure, our monetary and our law form through Rome. But Rome is built on Judeo-Christian construct emerged out of Rome, taking the Israeli Old Testament that was really just a synthesis of the Sumerian and the Egyptian.
Summary of it, yeah.
Well, more than a summary, it's a reconfiguring to create this singular Godhead that people call Yahweh, Jehovah, etc., etc.
Instead of many gods.
Well, there are many gods, the Anuna, the Anunnaki, and the Egyptian gods, but they root down to a very small number. And when you read Sitchin, one of the fundamentals that is still valid is he talks about Anu, and he talks about the two sons called Enlil and Enki. And then out of the next supposed generation is this man or this god called Marduk. And Marduk was the principal god of Babylon under or over Hammurabi. Okay. Now we have the Hammurabi Code, which is the root of the law form leading towards the Judeo-Christian structure and everything that we've been talking about. But who is Marduk? Marduk is actually not a being or a god. Marduk is an office. Okay. Yes. And basically, it goes back to the Sumerian. Okay. It comes from a Sumerian word, Duku. And Duku, and the word Mar is basically son of. And Duku was one of the principal locations and foundations of law of the Sumerian and the Anunnaki. And so the Marduku was the one who had authority. And Enlil, and this, a lot of pretty much everything I'm saying here now comes from Anton Parks's work. Enlil basically was when the Anuna or the Anunnaki, who were creations, clones and genetic creations under Anu, the godhead Anu, then the position that Enlil took in all of that was he was known as the territorial administrator for the entire planet. And the Sumerian word for territorial administrator is in Sumerian Satam, S-A-T-A-M, okay, which is where the word Satan comes from. Okay, so Enlil was the territorial administrator. And what do we have today? We basically have everything I've talked about with the politics, the nation states, the bankruptcy, the 3 city-states. It's all about territorial administration through military conquest.
And religion?
Pardon?
And religion?
Yeah. Well, of course, it built religion. Of course, that's a whole other subject. We can touch on that before we finish. But when I'm laying down its foundational is that Enlil, as the territorial administrator, known as and referred to as the Satam, actually became principal godheads or the gods through the Egyptian period, leading all the way to the Judaic and the Old Testament period. And he actually became transliterated through all of that, through, again, the language, the use of the consonants and vowels that eventually arrived at the English language. He became known as Yahweh, or those 4 letters YHWH, or they were obviously in Hebrew, but in the English language, YHWH. And there's another man whose work is also very important, whose name is Scott McQuaid. And he's deciphered and unraveled some very significant things in the Sumerian language. And the Sumerian language is the building blocks of the Sumerian language is something called a logogram. Logo in Latin and English, basically word blocks. You could call them a word block, logogram. Yeah. And the Sumerian is always written in English in capital letters. So you have the word, say, Enlil or En-ki. Well, the word En in Sumerian, capital E, capital N, basically means priest, or you could translate it to be Lord. En-ki means the Lord or the priest or the administrator of the earth, Ki being the earth. Okay, and Lil is, I actually forget what Lil, the root of it in Sumerian, but it's a variation of that. When we get to the Hebrew language, a lot of it is built on Egyptian and Sumerian, Aramaic, and related languages in Hebrew. And so by the time we get to the period in the so-called Babylonian captivity, of the Judaic or the Israeli tribes. Babylon was the powerhouse of the world at that point. I mean, it was the controlling city-state. It was the city-state of who? Of Marduk. If you look at the history of Babylon in that period, Marduk was the controller. Okay, but Marduk is a title. It really is referring to Enlil. And Babylon had the biggest libraries in the world, all the Sumerian texts, the Egyptian, and so forth. And so this so-called captivity of the Israeli priest, they had 50 years in the Babylonian libraries directed by Enlil and Marduk and his priests and so forth to construct the books and the structure of the Old Testament, because it was leading towards building the foundation of Judeo-Christian law form and religion, and basically the global system we're in today.
So Abraham was a high priest in the Babylonian system, was he?
Well, no. Abraham would go further back in history. Actually, if you go into Ralph Ellis's work, he identifies, see, Ralph Ellis has really deconstructed all the Egyptian period, the different dynasties, and who actually were Egyptian pharaohs, who were what then got transliterated to become King David, Solomon, and so forth. Abraham and Moses, these key building blocks, they were Egyptian, either high priests or pharaohs. And then their names in Egyptian became transliterated into Hebrew that eventually come down to us in English.
Okay.
Quite a complex structure,
yeah,
huh?
Yeah, it is. And question would be that there was a pharaoh, as I remember, Akhenaten, who showed his, let's say, his god next to him. They called it in the Egyptian times Sobek or Aten. So this entity looked just like a crocodile sitting next to him as a sculpture. Was this Enlil?
No, this was Enlil. Yes, yes, this was Enlil. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
But also you have to understand and know that during that period from really 1900, 1800 BC all the way through 1000 BC, so 800 or 900 years of Egyptian history. And this is where the work of Ralph Ellis is really significant, that ultimately you have two competing factions. And there were two Egypts. There was what's called Lower Egypt, which is actually higher on the north, up near Giza and the Delta area and so forth. And you have Upper Egypt. Well, Upper Egypt was basically controlled from the city called Thebes. So you basically have the Theban priesthood controlling Upper Egypt. And they were more pantheistic. They had the multiplicity of gods. They have Isis and Osiris, Set, Nut, Nuptis, and all the other Egyptian gods. Then in Lower Egypt,
Upper Egypt south, is it?
Upper Egypt is south. Okay.
Yep.
Down. And if you look on the map on the Nile, Thebes is much further south than Giza and Heliopolis and the Delta and so forth. So starting in the 18th dynasty, that culminated in the man known as Akhenaten, who was really in the original kings or pharaohs of his dynasty. He was called Amenhotep, and he was Amenhotep the fourth. But then he brought forth the Atan, the one God. So this is where monotheistic structure came in. And then if you look at linguistics again, the language, the phonetics, the word Atan or Aten is easily seen as the basis of the Hebrew word Adonai. Okay. And also as well, you go into Greek or Greece, you see the word Adonis, Adon, So you have Adonai in Hebrew, you have Adonis in Greek.
What
It's
does it mean in
all,
Hebrew, if I may ask?
well, Adonai basically is the same as Aten. It's the singular God. It's the monotheistic God that then ultimately became known as Yahweh or Jehovah. But you see, you take those four letters, YHWH, for what we would say as Yahweh, and if you match those with vowels, those are consonants, right? And the Hebrew language is primarily a consonant-based language with the marks that interset the vowels, which can be changed with the same consonants. But going back in the Egyptian and the Sumerian, it's basically a consonant. These are consonant-based languages. So if you take Yahweh or YHWH and you mirror it with a vowel to where the letter Y becomes the vowel I, the letter H becomes the vowel A. So if you look at the shape of an English H, if you just close the top, it becomes an A. Okay. You take Y, which also in English is considered a secondary vowel, and it will replace the vowel I. So I and Y can be interchangeable. Okay, so you have two H's, which become two A's. You have Y, which becomes I. H's become A, Y becomes I. And the other one, W, basically becomes the letter or the vowel U. I mean, listen to how we say the word, double U. Okay. And when we write AW, it looks like two V's. And V is really just a hard sounding U. U is a softer vowel. V is a harder consonant. Okay. So V and U can be interchangeable. You've got this letter W, which is really two V's, and it's the sound of it is W. So you have going forward from left to right, I-A-U-A. But in all these things of the manipulation of language to create language as a mind controlling structure where people say one thing, believing it's what they're saying, but it's something entirely different. You can take I-A-U-A and turn it around. A-U-A-I. Okay. Do you know what A-U-A-I? No, don't try to pronounce it. Just look at the vowels, the letters. A-U-A-I. Do you know what those? Okay. Write out the word Anunnaki.
Right. These are the...
There are the vowels of the word
Anunnaki.
Anunnaki, A-U-A-I. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So what we see on the front is YHWH, but what's mirrored and inverted or reversed are the vowels for the word Anunnaki. Okay.
Especially this reversal of everything, right?
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of clues, a lot of esoteric hidden insights or meaning can be found by reversing words. Even in English, you can do that. So people say, well, no, you don't do that. We read English left to right, not right to left. You don't do this. You don't mirror vowels to consonants. But that's not how the real structure of the mechanism of control is actually put in place.
This let's say, pattern of exchanging, replacing positive with negative, was also visible with the Sabbatian subtypes V's attitude of reversing the, let's say, positive views to negative views, where this came up through the Frankian Jacob Frank to the Rothschild family, and this was integrated later on into the Illuminati's structure and so on.
Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, and that clue or insight that I just went through with the Yahweh Anunnaki came from the work of Scott McQuaid. So again, if you do a search for his work, he has books, he has YouTube interviews and so forth. So this is where my deeper penetrating into the foundations of the control matrix of this world have led me to those three very important key players of Scott and Ralph Ellis and Anton Parks.
So following up the story from the Sumerians through the Egyptians and then the Holy Roman Empire and the Holy See, which is in control of the law of the sea, actually, right, with the martial law and so on, we came to the point that actually we can say that, as you mentioned, London as a commercial center of the system got established, initiated from Roman, let's say, ideas, and also how also the Washington D.C. came later on. So these 3 points of the world control, let's say, that these 3 city-states became established. Is that correct?
Yeah.
We lost quite a few things during those processes, I guess. During the, let's say, the King John's agreement with the Pope, we lost our property, I guess.
Yeah.
So because we don't own anything, just owned by the church.
Yeah.
Was it like that?
Well, of course, that event with John and the Pope was 1215, and 2 years later you have the Magna Carta. But see, the Magna Carta is not necessarily what people think. Again, it's a bait and switch. So you have a lot of people out there studying law and claiming common law, and we have common law rights, and we can create common law courts and juries and all the rest of it. But they don't understand the fundamentals of the building blocks of law. Essentially, if you want to stand on common law, you must have standing on the land. So you have 1213, the Holy Alliance, Unholy Alliance. Now, the title of king, the control of kingship in the British Isles or the Western Isles is now under the authority of the Pope. 2 years later, you have the barons who have landed title. They've been granted land by the sovereign, the crown, the king, and they have a relationship with the crown, with their land. They have what's called an Oath of Fealty. This is the feudal system. Fealty basically translates to loyalty. You pledge an oath of fealty to your sovereign who has granted you land. So it's a reciprocal relationship between the crown or the king, the sovereign, and the land. So these are what are called landed estates. They're really titled estates because they all have titles. They're given titles such as Earl, Duke, Count, and so forth. And that title passes from one living man to the next living man. That is called a sestike v, which is known as in English would be defined as a living beneficiary. So that's what attaches to the land. Going back to what I said about the 2 pillars and the arch, which is Anu, and which is really also Yahweh, which is ultimately Enlil, as the Satan or the Satan office of Satan as a territorial administrator. That also is representative esoterically in all systems that are really fundamental to all of this as 2 lines, the line of the king and the line of the priest. The priest controls.
Would you just hold on for a second? Just let's make it clear and straight for the people. So Enlil, as Marduk, as the Satan, is the god of the Bible.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And look at modern events now. Look at what the Roman Catholic Church has. They have images everywhere relative to representation of reptilian forms. There's the hall of I forget what it's called, but this big hall that's the pictures are out there all over, and it's got the 2 big eyes and the snake's tongue and everything. I mean, they're just telling you right there, it's hidden in plain sight. So back to the two pillars, which is fundamental. It's talked about in the book of Genesis. It's fundamental to the Masonic initiatory system. It's totally in our architecture. It's in every capital, the Roman style arches and pillars and so forth. But that is symbolic or representative of two lines: the line of the king, the line of the priest. The king, the line of the king is the controller of the land. So the crown, or the sovereign, as the king who has been coronated, which really means the circle around the sun. So it's all sun-related symbolism, which goes back to Egypt and Ra and the sun god and everything. So the Pope puts the sun on top of the king's head and now controls the king through that. That's his hierarchical relationship. And the king in turn now has authority. So the king controls the land. Okay. The king can give a grant of land to a lord or a titled man who has a title. And now that becomes a landed estate, that under the earl or the prince or whatever, that comes from the king and the oath of fealty. That oath requires the lord or the landlord to reciprocate that grant with supporting the king through arms, through men, through food, through rents, tithes. Be loyal. Okay. If that loyalty is abrogated or breached, the king sends his army in and basically takes the land away. Okay. So that's happened many times throughout history. Sometimes the king gets defeated and the one he goes after, wins that particular battle. But ultimately, through the inexorable, which means unstoppable sweep and force of history, eventually the world system has been set up again through the Holy Roman Empire to become the line of the king and the control of all the land, which also relates to the Pope and the papal bulls that were issued starting in 1302. The first one in 1302, known as the Unum Sanctum, or the Holy Unity, or the Sanctified Unity. And where is it sanctified? It's sanctified on the Holy See, which in Latin is the words that we get English for Holy See, or are Sedis Sanctum. Sedis means seat, sanctum means sanctified or holy. So the Sedis Sanctum is the throne of Peter upon which the papacy or the apostolic succession has been built. So the two letters of Sedis Sanctum are SS, and it just converted that to an English euphemism, basically the Holy See. But as you pointed out, the word see is what's known as a homophone, which means same phonetic or same sound. So the word see, S-E-E, reverts backwards to Latin as sedis, or the seat, but it also reverts forward to the English word sea, as in maritime, S-E-A. It also reverts to, or goes forward and refers to the letter C, which is the beginning letter of the word. Well, it's also Columbia, but it's also the word commerce. Yeah, and Columbia comes in too, because columba is the Latin word for dove. And this is where you get the other Latin word for dove is Dovid. And this is where they get an anagram of the word David. So David is known as the dove or the columba. This is why you have District of Columbia or Columbia. You have British Columbia, which links, across North America from the west over to District of Columbia. So it's all about creating these images. And of course, in the 60s, the peace movement adopted the dove as the symbol of peace, and they didn't know really what was behind that esoterically and symbolically. And you have the peace symbol, which is really the upside man being hung by his feet with the three bars in the head, and exactly like that. So we've been massively led down a path of illusion and fantasy, which is Alice in Wonderland, the opposite of the mirror. Everything we think on the front side is real or relevant is really reversed on the mirror, and it's hidden behind that. So you have the line of the king controlling the land. You have the Unum Sanctum as the unified, sanctified unity under the papacy and so forth. And essentially, there followed for about another 250 years a series of papal bulls or decrees from the Pope that established several fundamentals. The primary one is that the Pope basically said, all land, all flesh, and all souls belong to me. Okay, under the illusion of the authority that he is sitting on the throne of Peter, who was authorized by Jesus in the New Testament. You know, I will build my church on you, Peter, on the rock of Peter. But that goes back to both Latin and Egyptian, because the word for rock is Petra. That's where the name Peter comes from. But the word Petra goes back to the Egyptian, a god known as Ptah, P-T-A-H. So this again is how we root back to the language and back to the Egyptian and the Sumerian. And the line of the priest is the law of the priest. You know, the priest dictates the law. You can do this, you can't do that. This was written into the foundational documents in terms of the Old Testament. Basically, it's a given, or it's a standard accepted fact that the entire global world system of law that relates to obviously the monetary system is based on the law that's presented in the Bible, because that comes from God, or the Lord, which, as we've now delineated, is really Yahweh, which is behind him is all the rest that we've talked about. I started in the beginning by saying that the Pantera Society is a private society. You have to understand how the law actually works, because there is, and this relates also to accounting and financial structure and everything, because we actually are living simultaneous in two realities. Remember, I said that we are actual true living beings. We are embodied in the flesh. We have certain levels of presence, soul, spirit, capacity, universal principles, and all the rest of it. There is a fundamental or foundational level of true law, what we would call true law on a universal principle level of things. But this is where the reverse, or the mirroring, the Alice in Wonderland comes in, because there's a public side to it. That public side is a legal system. It's not a lawful system. And people who have studied law are finding this out. And so this is where they go into, well, okay, the foundations of law are English common law. So I'm claiming common law rights and so forth. But what people don't understand is the primary controlling element in law is the law of contract. Because we exist in a free will universe. We have actual full and absolute sovereign free will. The only way beings with sovereign free will can come together in mutual agreement and harmonious relationships is by contract. So if you and I enter into a contract, we create our own law. Okay. Contract actually can create private law. But when you read contracts, almost all contracts establish the law form and the jurisdiction of the contract back to the public side. So you and I can create a contract, and you and I agree that we're going to do such and such. You know, I'm going to give you a basket of apples, and you're going to give me a basket of oranges, and we agree that this is our agreed contract. But if we write it down and we say our agreement now is in the state of California, and if there's a disagreement or a dispute, we're going to go to the state of California and its jurisdiction to settle the dispute. We've just given jurisdiction of our private contract to a public entity called State of California. Okay. If we give that jurisdiction, then we must adhere to that jurisdiction. If we go to the state of California, or even the country of Hungary or Austria, wherever we go, and we say we want to create a company, and we go to whatever the authority to do that in California, you go to the Secretary of State and you say, I want to create a corporation. Well, if you create the corporation in their jurisdiction under their rules, you are now controlled by their rules. So if you operate that corporation, you must adhere to and follow the rules of the state of California. If you create an entity in the United Kingdom or in Hungary, same thing. If we go international, we say there's places like Panama or the Bahamas, we can create corporations. We're bound to the law of that corporation, of that jurisdiction. Okay, so there's a distinction between public law and private law. Public law is the legal system. The legal system, when we get into the root of the word legal has the same root as the word legiance or allegiance. Now, have you ever heard the phrase liege lord?
No.
Okay. Well, we're back to the landed estates, the living beneficiary, the cestacea, the titled land, of the earl or the duke or the lord who's been given land by the sovereign, and the land and the Oath of Fealty. The Oath of Fealty establishes that the crown who has granted the land to the landlord now, that's called a oath of allegiance. Okay, we can call it an oath of fealty, which is loyalty, but it's also an oath of allegiance. That then establishes the crown sovereign as a liege lord. Allegiance, liege lord. That's an oath of loyalty or allegiance. Okay. The word liege and allegiance and legal and legislation all have the same root. When we are in the state of California, we're under their legal authority. So basically all of the so-called laws, the legal legislated acts, codes and bills and statutes and ordinances are really under the authority of the law of the see, which ultimately does go back to the Holy See, the law of the Pope and the Holy See, and something that's called the Roman Curia. Curia means court in Latin. Roman Curia means the Roman court. All courts in the public legal system are under the authority of the Roman Curia. They're all Roman courts because they're all operating the procedures known as Napoleonic Code or Roman Civil Code of a conquered people that is controlling the civil body by the law of the sea. So then we get into commerce. What is commerce? Commerce is the relationship of merchants and mariners and their property. Okay. When you go back in language, the word merchant ultimately means banker, because when they created the law merchant, or what was called lex mercantoria in Latin, it was all about the control of property being carried by mariners from one jurisdiction, like from Rome to Greece, and the banking relationships to secure the property in the boat and to secure the interests of the property owner and the ship owner. And what you have to understand, this is really something that's going to tweak a lot of people what they think they know. The actual entity that wrote and issued the Declaration of Independence was supposedly the American people. It was actually agents for the English East India Company. And there were two entities vying for control of North America. One was called the British, one was called the English. There's a distinction and difference. And I will refer you and your viewers to an extraordinary book that opens all this up by a man in New Zealand whose name is Ewan, E-W-A-N, Campbell, C-A-M-P-B-E-L-L. And that, of course, goes back to Scotland and the Scottish and the Campbell clan. And he's in New Zealand. Long story made short, he had big trouble with the New Zealand government. They put him in prison for a completely ridiculous thing. And then he started studying the law and he unraveled things. And now he just published a book. If you do a search on his name and the book name, What is the Government? You will learn about the English versus the British, which we don't have time to go into. I'll just leave it at that. So I'm giving you basically 5 very important researchers and their works. Ewan Campbell, What is the Government? Ralph Ellis, who goes into all the Egyptian and the Roman period and unravels who Jesus really was in real terms, historical terms, and who David was, who the Queen of Sheba, all these things. His work is extraordinary. The third one is Anton Parks, who goes into Sumerian and the language. The fourth one is Scott McQuaid and his work with language and the Sumerian roots of language. And there's a fifth one, which we'll catch up with before we close. So lots of illusions throughout history. Okay. The American country that we call the United States of America, has many layers of false mythology and actual underlying facts. Okay. This requires a lot of research, and it requires a lot of keeping one's mind open and being able to hold a lot of facts that you have been programmed to not be able to see. You have to deprogram the mythology and the narrative that we were taught and start finding the underlying true narrative. When you do that, you start seeing the real picture of a continuum of history going back thousands of years with Sumeria, the Anunnaki, Enki and Enlil and Marduk, Egyptian, the upper and lower Egypt, the Theban priesthood, and the Akhenaten Eton priesthood, how that then morphed into the Israeli period and David and the Davidic line. The Davidic line ultimately became the monarchical houses of Europe, and where they justified that became the basis of Rome, the Roman Church, and then the Holy Roman Empire, leading ultimately to a complete global conquest that was all ultimately legal because of one fundamental thing. The fundamental is that we live in a universe that is based on sovereign free will. We actually have full, absolute sovereign free will. But in sovereign free will, we can contract with another being. And if we enter into a contract voluntarily, then we can modify or diminish our capacity and our standing and create a bond to another jurisdiction. The word jurisdiction in Latin, it means, juris means law, diction means the word of the law, but juris underneath that also means oath. So when we contract our sovereign free will as a voluntary contractee with a public legal system, we are giving an oath of fealty or allegiance. And when we do that, we are required to follow all of the rules, which are legislatively created to basically create the rules that manage and control the civil body in the Roman civil legal system.
So because of not being aware of that, we continuously through time, we lost our property. We lost property by the Verona Agreement. Mm-hmm. Then we lost peace through the law of the land, law of the sea. Mm-hmm. Then we lost freedom, financial freedom, and so on through the London City and so on, I guess. Mm-hmm. And that was only just, let's say, a cherry on the pie that in 2009, July 7th, Pope Benedict XVI issued an encyclical letter that this was the most authoritative document the Pope can issue, calling for the establishment of a world political authority. In other words, the New World Order. Mm-hmm. So basically, the current administrational bodies, what we see, are heading towards this whole globally controlled world order that is controlled by the religious part, the monotheistic religious part that controls the the monetary systems and the military.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, and then I mean, to make a very long story short, the law of the priest basically got transliterated or migrated into the secular legal structure. And the root of that is Washington, D.C., because D.C. became the third of the three city-states controlling basically commerce or the financial system and the military. City of London controls the law through the Bar Association and the oaths of allegiance that bar attorneys attached to London or the City of London. By the way, you mentioned I'm a lawyer. Well, I'm a private lawyer. I'm not an attorney. I'm not in the bar. A lawyer is basically one learned in the law, which I certainly am. And so you really have commerce, military controlling the physical or the flesh of the bodies of humanity. You have City of London controlling the bar, the law, the fundamental, the banking system, and basically ultimately the land through the crown. And then the Vatican sitting on top, controlling the spiritual side or the souls, the spirit, and so forth. So this is how the world system has been constructed to control the land and the flesh and the souls. But what you also, everybody needs to understand, everything you said is true. Everything we're describing is this historical process over thousands of years to set up this world dominant system. And of course, many people know that we're in the last stage of the attempt to collapse the world economy, basically get the flesh merged with the transhumanistic through the binary coded computer system through the means of what's happened in the last 2.5 years, and get total compliance, total control through a global computerized transhumanistic bondage between man and machine, which is basically an AI consciousness. And we'll touch on that before we close. So you have three city-states that are reflective of our living presence in physical, in corporeal form, not incorporeal, that is incorporated, but we're corporeal. We're living in these living bodies. Okay. And they're trying to bond and bind the flesh and capture the souls to create a completely contained world system that's perpetual bondage, perpetual financial debt, and so forth. And eventually, not eventually, now it's imminent, if they were to succeed, collapse it into what they call, Klaus Schwab in the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset. Collapse everything, say you don't own anything, we own you and everything, but you'll quote unquote be happy. Well, you'll only be happy if you comply with the rules. And if you don't comply, well, we own you too. We own your flesh. So we will just basically
Delete you.
Liquidate you, delete you. But this is reflective of the being in this embodied flesh. We have a physical body, we have an emotional body, we have a mental body, and we have higher bodies, higher consciousness, and higher dimensional levels of who we actually are. And this is mirrored in the three city-states. You've got DC representing the physical through the military enforcement, control of the people, and the commercial bondage through essentially the law of the priest binding us to their legal financial compliance. And you have the City of London controlling the land and the Crown, the Crown Corporation of London controlling our mental body, or the Crown on our system of, energetic relationship to our bodies. And then you have the Vatican controlling the spiritual body, or the heart, or the emotional, getting everybody to bind themselves emotionally to this projected, mirrored false reality of a God and a savior and all those fundamentals of that. And so really what we're talking about ultimately is there's a true template of life in this world, a template of a living system that we're integrally part of. We are unique as expressions of that life, but we're also one with that life. They're trying to mirror it and create a false mirrored reality of that. It has the similitude of true reality, but it's a projected, mirrored, false reality. Okay. That's why our consciousness, through mind control and amnesia of who we are, forgetting all of these fundamentals, it seems like, well, this is a real world. It seems like this is, church and state and popes and saviors and governments and kings and priests and presidents, that they're here for our benefit, which they're not.
I think I got your point, or the direction of this conversation, which goes into the level of understanding the deeper reality, which resides in us and in our minds. Before we come to that back for a little bit, may we just stay with a physical level for a moment, because usually the question comes, what we can do now, what can we do now in order to be able to let's say handle this situation, or to jump out of it. And there are basically two lines which we can focus on. One is the individual part, what an individual can do, we as people, or we ourselves as people, living beings, let's say, feeling living beings. And the other one is what on a governmental level one can do. So, what a government can do. So,
okay, well, excuse me for interrupting, but let me get right to the core of that. Okay. What I was just saying is basically we have a living template, a real reality. We have a false, projected, reversed, mirrored reality that we've been seduced and entrained to believe is real, that we are required to align with, and all of that. It has, the current world system has all the original building blocks of the real reality. What we are required to do is to learn and understand the difference between what's real and what is a projected similitude of that mirrored reality, and then understand how those building blocks, that they turned around upside down, inside out, just as with the language as I described it and everything else, that we have the capacity, because see, we have volunteered to attach ourselves to that system. We thought that in order to survive in the money system, in the legal system, we had to follow all the rules, and we had to comply with the way the money system was set up. But the money system was set up to ultimately turn the entire world into a bankrupt, attach the collateral, which is how the rules of commerce works. There's always a secured creditor, there's a debtor, and there's the collateral. Well, the world system set it up that all property on the planet and all living beings became the collateral against this global debt. All the nation states, from Hungary to everybody else, every other nation state, were turned into also subdivisions. I said state of California is a corporate subdivision of the bankrupt United States. Well, so is Hungary now. So is the United Kingdom. So is Australia. They're corporate bankrupt entities. And this was designed to basically seize all of the property, people, and so forth, and bind it according to that papal bull to own all the land, the flesh, and the souls. But there's one key thing here. As a voluntary contract, we can rescind that contract. We can remove ourselves from the bondage. We have the capacity to do that. You asked about what does it mean to have standing on the land? Well, in law, English common law, when a titled man has a title, earl, duke, and so forth, they are on the land. They have a grant of land. They have the Oath of Fealty relationship, and they have standing in law. This goes back to the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was only between the king and the barons, who brought this to the king and basically said, you better sign this. The feudal system, the serfs, were landless. They don't have land. They don't have standing on the land, which means standing in law. Also, if you are a bankrupt under maritime rules, admiralty, civil procedures, You don't have any standing in law. Until you properly separate yourself from that voluntary bondage and oath of jurisdiction, you have no standing. Standing is equivalent to having the capacity to state a claim. If you go into these legal jurisdictions, you actually have no standing in law. You must be represented by an attorney who attorns you or turns you back into a public person, and you actually have no rights, no standing. You can't state a claim, and the court will act for what's best for the public state. You have no standing to state a claim, and you have no standing to stake a claim. When you stake a claim on the land, you actually put 4 stakes in the corners and you claim it, and that becomes your land. You can't do that under your impaired status. So on an individual level, most important fundamental thing is education. I can tell you all these things, but in this 2-hour conversation, we've touched on vast amounts of understanding and knowledge and integration and history and law and money and all the rest of it. Just me telling you will not basically build your own inner capacity to really integrate this. So education is fundamental. That's why we created the Gemstone University, and we're about to start building a global media platform, as you and I discussed privately, and we'll talk about next time we can get together. And that's fundamentally for education and for media. Our name, Gemstone, is an acronym. It stands for Global Education and Media. Standing together, which means in a unified way, our noble expression, our expression of our own nobility. You know, this illusion that there are nobles, that there are kings and priests, and they're noble and we're just landless peasants is bullshit. It's an illusion. We have an inner being of who we are that is of the highest nobility. Okay, so that's where Gemstone comes from, our noble expression, standing together, global education and media. So one must really have the passion and the drive and the will to really start learning these things. You could take the transcript of what we've talked about here for 2 hours, and we just outlined a 2-year course of postdoctorate education.
Yeah, so we are talking about the Gemstone University, which can be accessed on gemstoneuniversity.org. And we really recommend our viewers to check it out and subscribe, because it works to go through the
you can subscribe.
Material.
You can go to YouTube and Rumble and all those platforms. We have a lot of videos where I explain a lot more in detail. And yes, that's the place to go. But also, let's get to that's on the individual level. Let's get to the macro scale on the global level.
Maybe stay for a second with the individual level, because there are some handy advices which people are expecting somehow. Of course, the detailed information on how to jump out of the system and how to peacefully and legally, let's say, free up oneself can be found on Gemstone University. And this is a matter of further learning for the people. At the same time, for example, people are talking about creating barter systems, producing their own food, conducting home births, teaching their children at home, avoiding mainstream media, creating social networks. I mean, I guess these can also have as a medium solution till one gets to the knowledge where one can also.
Well, as I mentioned, we're about to start building the Gemstone Media Alliance, which is going to build an architecture, technically speaking, of a global system. I don't want to get into that because I have to go in a few minutes, so I'd like to wrap up this conversation. But next time when we get together, we can talk about the media that we're going to build. It relates to your group and what you're doing with your Nexus TV and everything. And virtually everybody who wants to participate. It will be built in the private. It will be built in our private jurisdiction. It will not have attachments of control and censorship and manipulation. So when you talk about whether barter systems or new private monetary issue or creating communities, other private societies connecting through a universally accessible platform that's not controlled, this is what we're going to be building. So what I'd like to close with is that on the macro scale, in summary, everything we've described is a sweep of history over thousands of years to build a global system controlled from behind by a satanic consciousness that is this Enlil et al. Godhead. That's a false precept based on what was inserted or infiltrated into this world as a living creational field, and that we can delineate and follow that over thousands of years. We've just summarized it here, and it led to our current system, the world system. But there is also a counterforce or an emerging force that has taken a position and set things up. Can't go into the detail of that now because we don't have the time. But, you know, today is September 30th, which happens to be the last day of the corporate fiscal year of the U.S. corporation, which is itself a bankrupt. The plan, in summary, was to bankrupt every nation state on the planet, to bind by legal construction all of the people to become the collateral against that global debt, eventually to liquidate that bankruptcy, claiming ownership forever of that collateral, meaning you and me and every living man, woman, child on the planet, and own us forever in a new reset, great reset, Klaus Schwab, all of the rest of it. But something happened over the last 20 years. It got flipped over. What has happened is the bankrupt thinking that they were the creditor has now been flipped over, and they have become the complete debtor of the entire world system. That bankrupt corporation has already been liquidated. This is the precursor to things that will happen over the next couple of months. What will happen over the next couple of months, for one, is going to be made public. It's going to reveal all of the history, the false systems, false precepts, and especially what's happened in recent years, the last 4 or 5 years, especially since Donald Trump became president, and then this false regime of the Bidens and everything that's exposed him. And the ultimate is that we who were the presumptive debtors in their system have become the creditors, and everything is being liquidated so that the people are actually going to be set free from this bondage and control system that was built over thousands of years. So I will leave you with that, because that's a big story, but you're actually going to see it before possibly you and I can even talk about that. You know, we can talk offline about if we can fit in another session here shortly, but if we can't, you'll see it. If not, if we can have a session, maybe we'll go into some detail. But we don't need to talk about, well, how can we deal with, you know, the larger scale or even the individual scale? Things are about to happen. They're already in place. That's going to change everything. So I will leave you with that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. To your viewers, please check out Mr. Kenneth.
Okay, but don't call me Mr.
Okay.
Okay. Call me Ken. Call me Kenneth. Call me Kenneth Scott. One last thing I mentioned, there is a fifth source that I would like to strongly recommend for you and everybody. There's a man whose name is Jason, and he has a website and he has a YouTube channel. The YouTube and website, the name is Archaics, which stands for, or the letters, it's spelled ARCHIEX.com, or Archaics. You can find it in YouTube. Jason is absolutely brilliant. He's the most extraordinary researcher and teacher that I've ever found. And he has a grasp of history and the details of it that are beyond reach. They're phenomenal. He actually spent 26 years in prison in Texas from the age of 17. And during those 26 years, he did nothing but read. And he read thousands of original historical books going back thousands of years. And he determined certain very significant key pieces about the reality we're in, which is basically a holographic simulation control system that everything we've talked about in this call fits into. So I'm going to leave it at that because it's way bigger than even that description, but it's totally integrated with my work, the other people I mentioned, and other things. And if you want to know the truth of the reality we're in, read those authors I said and connect to archaics.com.
So, dear all, let's thank together to Kenneth, and let us visit banterabca.org, gemstoneuniversity.org, and let's browse on Rumble Kenneth Scott. Thank you very much.
Yeah, not Kenneth Scott. Look for Gemstone University and YouTube and the other ones.
Great.
Okay, great.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Kenneth.